Going all the way back to UFC 1, even when it was marketed with slogans like "2-man enter, 1-man leaves, and there are no rules," extremely talented technical fighters like Royce Gracie and Ken Shamrock were the stars of the show. Same with the first Pancrase event happening just before the first UFC event in September of '93, also including Ken Shamrock, Funaki, and Bas Rutten. Pride 1 featured Royce's older brother Rickson Gracie in the main event. As the years have gone on and the skill level has continually increased, more and more complete MMA fighters have emerged with each generation and year that passes by. Fighters so incredible and prestigious that history won't soon forget them, as they have become the ultimate blueprints for future fighters to aspire to. That's not to say none of these fighters are flawed or even controversial, but their mastery and technique still shine through. And today I'm here to talk about the best to ever do it. I'm Jason from MMA On Point, and these are the best MMA fighters in history. So there is zero way I'm gonna please half of you on this list. Without a doubt, it's the toughest subject matter to tackle, because the truth is there are a lot of subjective elements to this. I'll try my best to lay out the most objective reasons I can, but ultimately this is my opinion, and thankfully I'm not afraid of expressing it. Be sure to leave a comment with your top 10 fighters, or even top 5 if that suits you best, in the comments. I'm definitely game to debate any and all of this. Just keep it classy. Number 10, BJ Penn. Starting off with a fighter that would take on anyone, anywhere, at any time, BJ Penn's first championship was actually against Matt Hughes in the middle of his incredibly dominant first championship reign, and he did it as a tremendous underdog, coming up from 155 to 170. To everyone's surprise, he then left the UFC to fight other competition, including a 225-pound Lyoto Machida in K1. When he returned, he challenged GSP and Matt Hughes again in a couple of losing bids, and immediately began what is still perhaps the most impressive lightweight title streak to date, beating rival and former champ Jens Pulver just before doing so, and dominating Joe Stevenson, Sean Shirk, Kenny Florian, and Diego Sanchez as the 155-pound champ. It was also during this streak that he challenged Georges St Pierre again after he became the welterweight champion in one of the only real and true super fights in MMA history. His record closed out with a 16-12 record, presuming he doesn't actually fight again, and it's one of the most deceptive records when you look at it. 6 of those losses came from men far out of his weight range, and Frankie Edgar 3 times, so that accounted for 9 of his 12 losses. What he did was nothing short of spectacular in his career. Number 9, Randy Couture. Here's another fighter with a deceptive record, 19-11. It definitely doesn't tell you the whole story. He's a true pioneer of the sport, being one of the first Olympic wrestlers in MMA, whose introduction to the sport was winning the UFC 13 heavyweight tournament. He's a 3-time UFC heavyweight champ and 2-time light heavyweight champ. He's got wins over Vitor Belfort twice, Maurice Smith, Jeremy Horn, Kevin Randleman, Pedro Hizzo twice as well, Chuck Liddell, Tito Ortiz, Tim Sylvia, Gabriel Gonzaga, Brandon Vera, Mark Coleman, and James Lights Out Tony. Okay, that last one was more of a clinic than it was a competitive fight, but it's incredible that he accomplished so many of these things, especially past his 40s. He only cared about fighting the best and competing at a higher level, and as you can see from his resume, he did it better than almost anyone ever. And also, during the middle of his last heavyweight title reign, he actually tried to sue the UFC in part so he could leave and fight the then pound-for-pound king Fedor Emelianenko in Affliction. He just wanted to fight the best. It's incredible what Couture achieved, and it's hard to imagine what he could have accomplished if he started just a little bit younger. Number 8, Chuck Liddell. As the former face of the UFC and one of the most instrumental fighters in bringing the sport to popularity in the West and out of the Dark Ages, it's evident why he would be on this list. Like everyone on here so far, he comes from that old generation of guys that would fight absolutely anyone, whether they were heavyweights coming down to light heavy, or he'd go after them himself and other organizations like Pride when it was on top of the world. He earned wins over Jeff Monson, Pele, Kevin Randleman, Guy Metzger, Murilo Bustamante, Vitor Belfort, Bob Lucerbral twice, Alistair Overeem, Tito Ortiz twice, and the only man to knock out Randy Couture cold, and he did that twice. He also beat Jeremy Horn and had one of the most epic clashes and a winning bid against Wanderlei Silva at UFC 79. His streak as the light heavyweight champion is one of the very best in the sport, and as a result of his wins in rivalries that are still perhaps the most legendary in the sport, he earns a top spot as one of the elites in MMA history. Number 7, Wanderlei Silva. While Liddell was on top of the light heavyweight division, Pride middleweight champion Wanderlei Silva was perhaps the most dominant champion the sport had ever seen. He held 22 wins in Pride, the man with the most of any Pride competitor, also holding a 20-fight unbeaten streak in Pride. He won the 2003 middleweight tournament, one that Liddell had entered, and was eliminated by Rampage Jackson. In that same tournament, he brutally knocked out Jackson and did it again at Pride 28 for what was considered the fight of the year. He holds wins over Guy Metzger, Dan Henderson, Sakuraba 3 times, Tamura, an epic draw with Cro Cop, Ricardo Arona, Fujita, Michael Bisping, Kung Lee, and Brian Stan. It wasn't until near the fall of Pride that he was knocked out brutally by Cro Cop and Dan Henderson that you started to see him fade. Incredibly, he still competes today and is going for a 4th fight against Rampage Jackson in Bellator. Number 6, Demetrius Johnson. I've said it before, and I think it bears repeating that DJ's phenomenal streak as flyweight champion is unlikely to be beaten in the next 10 or even 20 years. He holds the record for the most consecutive title defenses at an astounding 11 in total, with 13 unbeaten fights at flyweight back-to-back. He earned the SB in 2017 for Fighter of the Year, a distinction only a handful of fighters have ever earned, as well as multiple Fighters of the Year awards through various publications. He earned Submission of the Year in 2017 with his incredible armbar over Ray Borg, and right up until the loss to Henry Cejudo, he was considered the #1 pound-for-pound fighter in the world. He's got wins over Miguel Torres, Ian McCall, Joseph Benavidez 3 times, John Dotson twice, Horiguchi, Henry Cejudo the first time, and famously Ray Borg in his win at UFC 216. The only knock on him has been a perceived lack of competition or a lack of name value with his competitors, either of which are impossible to quantify objectively. What he's done is nothing short of incredible. His only UFC losses are to then champion Dominic Cruz in 2011 and now Cejudo. Number 5, Daniel Cormier. As of the time of this video, Cormier sits at the top of the pound-for-pound list on UFC.com. He's the UFC's 2nd ever simultaneous 2-weight champion at light heavyweight and heavyweight with his win over Stipe Miocic at UFC 226. He now currently holds the longest title streak in UFC competition going back to 2015, first winning the light heavyweight belt against Anthony Johnson via rear naked choke. His only officially recorded loss ever is from Jon Jones at UFC 182, and after his 2nd loss was overturned due to Jones's positive drug test at 214, he only has that 1 loss. Meanwhile, he holds wins over Jeff Monson, Bigfoot Silva, Josh Barnett, Frank Mir, Roy Nelson, Pat Cummins, Dan Henderson, Anthony Johnson twice, Alexander Gustafsson, Anderson Silva, Volkan Oezdemir, and now Stipe Miocic. Most of those wins he completely dominated. He also has an Olympic wrestling background where he was even team captain of the US 2008 squad. At the age of 39 and a couple more fights that could include one more fight with Jones, it could be a chance to claim the top spot ever if he can avenge that loss. Number 4, Fedor Emelianenko. This man never lost from May 2000 when his career began all the way until 2010 against Fabricio Verdum. And no, I don't count the ring's phobia of cuts as a loss. Sports Illustrated called him the fighter of the decade in the 2000s, and his title defense against Cro Cop was even heralded as the fight of the decade as well. The only other man to hold the Pride heavyweight belt was Big Nog, and he beat him decisively twice, a man who was unbeatable prior to Fedor. He holds wins over Ricardo Arona, Babalu Sabral, Heath Herring, Big Nog, Fujita, Gary Goodridge, Mark Coleman twice, Kevin Randleman, Cro Cop, Mark Hunt, former UFC champs Tim Sylvia and Andrei Arlovsky, in addition to many others like Frank Mir. The only reason I don't rate him higher despite all of that is, well, he has the least amount of actual title defenses on this list with just 3 in Pride, and most of those guys were honestly over the hill. Both of the Coleman fights, Randleman, Fujita, all fit that description, and Mark Hunt was at a low point in his career. The truth is, Fedor was fed a lot of cans per the Japanese system back then, like Zulu Zinho, Kosaka, Ogawa, Matt Linlin, and Hongman Choi. Don't get me wrong, although extremely impressive, enough to get him to the number 4 spot of all time, his only real top competition fights in Pride during that entire reign, when you subtract those names, were against Big Nog and Cro Cop. Tim Sylvia and Arlovsky were even past their primes as well after Pride. Had he also earned a UFC title, it would be really hard not to see him topping the list. I'm not arguing one way or another that it was his fault or it was Dana's. I'm neutral to that. I don't really know what happened, neither does anybody else. Regardless, we never got to see Fedor fight those guys while they were all on top. Number 3, Anderson Silva. Anderson checks all of the boxes here. Incredible win streak, huge names, objectively against top level competition, heart, and some of the most brutal KOs in the sport's history. He holds several Fight of the Year, Fighter of the Year, and KO of the Year distinctions. He holds the most finishes in UFC history with a tie against Donald Cerrone and Vitor Belfort at 14 total. And it's important to keep in mind that all of his finishes except for Chris Lieben before he got the belt and his forays at light heavyweight were all title shots against the best in the world. He holds wins over Carlos Newton, Jeremy Horn, Lee Murray, Chris Lieben, Rich Franklin twice, Dan Henderson, Patrick Cote, Forrest Griffin, Damian Maia, Chael Sonnen twice, Vitor Belfort, Yushin Okami, and Stephan Bonner. His fight with Dan Henderson was also a title unification with the Pride welterweight belt Hendo held. The only thing holding him back are his USADA violations. The second incident was reduced to negligence instead of being called outright doping. If it wasn't for that, he'd easily be in contention for the best fighter ever. Number 2, George St Pierre. He holds only 2 losses from 2002 to 2017 as of the time of this video, and it includes another man who could have easily been on this list, Matt Hughes, and the biggest upset in MMA history, losing to Matt Serra. He's the 2-time undisputed welterweight champion and the 1-time middleweight champion with his win over Michael Bisping at UFC 217. He's been awarded Fighter of the Year on many occasions. When you include his interim title against Matt Hughes at UFC 79 and his middleweight title, along with the rest of his undisputed title wins, GSP actually has the record for the most title wins in UFC history, 13 total. He's got wins over Karo Parisian, Frank Trigg, Sean Shirk, BJ Penn twice, Matt Hughes twice, Josh Koscheck twice, Matt Serra, John Fitch, Thiago Alves, Dan Hardy, Jake Shields, Carlos Condit, Nick Diaz, Johnny Hendricks, and Michael Bisping. You could easily argue it's the best MMA resume in history. He's dominated nearly all of his opponents from bell to bell and has a completely clean doping record, not a single violation. In fact, he was an early proponent of WADA or Olympic level testing like the UFC now employs through USADA. It's one of the chief reasons why you could argue he is the best of all time, and it's hard to argue with anyone that thinks that. So before I do get to number 1, I want to show some of the best ever that just as easily could have made it onto this list one way or another. As fans, we're lucky to have such talent come through the ranks over the years. I'm sure many of you will argue that they should have been on this list. Once again, I encourage you to comment your top 10 or top 5 fighters below. Number 1, Jon Jones. This is an unpopular choice, and I fully realize that. There are a ton of reasons to dislike this man. Of the UFC's champions, you could say without batting an eye that he is the most controversial ever. The hit and run of a pregnant woman, drag racing, jail time, USADA violations, altercations outside of the ring, and his two-faced media appearances.
Hey pussy, are you still there?
Take your pick. But this is where we have that facts over feelings conversation. I don't care if you dislike him, think he's an awful guy. Hell, we were all pissed at him for hitting that lady and running away. That was awful, despicable, it was terrible. But none of that has anything to do with his official record. You can infer he was cheating in those other fights, sure, but you're opening up a massive can of worms if you really want to start poking around with USADA level testing prior to it being officially adopted. Every single fighter on this list has been accused of the exact same thing.
I'm super suspicious about all those old fights now, though.
Well, those Nogueira fights, those weren't fake.
No, that's not what I mean. That's not what I mean. I mean steroids.
Challenge the champion for the belt.
The difference is that he can't take steroids anymore because of USADA.
There are uncomfortable realities about doping and not just MMA, but sports in general. Even a cursory level examination can begin to uncover this.
Do you think that
They're all doping. Every single one of them.
50 times over the last 6 years I've been tested. In competition, out of competition, at home, at a race, 7 in the morning, 7 at night, whatever, and they're all clean.
It was his teammates who had turned on him as part of the federal investigation.
Yes or no? Did you ever take banned substances to enhance your cycling performance?
Yes.
Serena Williams locks herself in panic room and drug test mix-up. Oh, it's just a mix-up, ladies and gentlemen.
The fact is, Jones beat a murderer's row of competitors that I don't think any other resume can compete with. He beat Stephan Bonner, Brandon Vera, Ryan Bader, Shogun, Lyoto Machida, Rampage Jackson, Rashad Evans, Vitor Belfort, Chael Sonnen, Gustafsson, Glover Teixeira, OSP, and who could forget his win over over DC in 2015. And let's be clear, I'm not here to tell you what you want to hear. People have been asking for this list for the full year that the channel has been around, and I'm not sugarcoating anything. Again, tell me why I'm wrong, and I'll appreciate the dialogue. Just don't be a dick about it. Thanks for watching my list, guys. If you enjoyed the video, subscribe and like. We upload at least 3 videos per week about MMA, and it really helps us out when you do so. If I missed anything on this vid, let me know in the comments, and feel free to follow me on Twitter at JasonTheHeart, or follow the official channel account at OnPointMMA. Thanks for watching so much, and I'll catch you on the next video.
So naturally, it's time to look at the legends, the champions who held their titles for hundreds of days, building up a collection of title defenses that made them staples of their divisions and even the sport itself. Through these reigns, iconic moments were crafted that will live forever. I'm Tom from MMA On Point, and this is 10 longest UFC title reigns.